The day Etta Conley found the foreclosure notice nailed to her front door, the sky above Harlan County, Texas, was the most beautiful shade of gold she had ever seen, which struck her as the cruelest kind of joke the universe had ever played. It was the spring of 1878, and the land she stood on had been her father's land before it was hers, and his father's land before it was his. 3 generations of Conleys had broken their backs on this stretch of red earth in the hill country north of San Antonio. 3 generations had buried their dead in the little plot beneath the 2 live oaks at the southwest corner of the property. 3 generations had watched the same sunsets paint the same hills in that same impossible gold. And now, because of a debt her late husband Clarence had accrued in secret with the Cattlemen's Bank of Harlan, all of it, every acre, every fence post, every weathered board of the farmhouse, had been sold at auction to settle what was owed. Etta read the notice twice, her fingers steady even as her heart was not. She was 28 years old. She had buried her father at 22, her mother at 24, and Clarence at 27. She was not a woman who fell apart easily. But as she stood there on the porch she had swept clean just that morning, she felt the particular hollow grief that comes not from losing a person, but from losing the ground beneath your feet. The notice said the new owner would arrive within the fortnight to inspect his property. It said she had 30 days to vacate the premises. It was signed by one J. Rourke. She had never heard the name before. She folded the paper carefully, tucked it into the pocket of her apron, and walked back inside to finish the bread she had been baking. Jedediah Rourke arrived on a Tuesday, 11 days after the notice, which was 3 days earlier than Etta had expected. She heard the hoofbeats first, then the creak of a wagon, and she set down her mending and walked to the window with the deliberate calm of a woman who had decided she would not be caught off guard by anything this man could bring. What she saw surprised her. She had expected someone older. Richer men who bought land at foreclosure auctions tended, in her experience, to be thick around the middle and thin on patience. Instead, the man who climbed down from the wagon seat was somewhere around 32 or 33, lean and sun-darkened in the way of men who had spent most of their lives outdoors. He wore a plain canvas duster that had seen considerable weather, and his hat was the color of old tobacco. He moved carefully, not in the hesitant way of a cautious man, but in the deliberate way of one who had learned that the world rewards attention. He stood in her yard and looked at the farmhouse with an expression she could not quite read from the window, and then he looked at the outbuildings, and then he looked at the hills, and he stood very still for a long moment as if he were listening to something. Then he turned and looked directly at the window where she stood. Etta did not step back. She walked to the front door and opened it before he could knock. They regarded each other for a moment that lasted longer than moments usually do. "You are early, Mr. Rourke," she said. "I am," he agreed. His voice was lower than she had expected and carried the faint remnant of an Irish lilt that had been mostly worn away by years of American plains. "I apologize for that. I can come back in 3 days if you prefer." She had not expected an apology. She studied him for another moment, recalibrating. "The notice said 30 days, she said. "It did." "I have not yet had 30 days. "No, ma'am, you have not." He reached up and took his hat off, which was a more courteous gesture than she had anticipated. His hair was dark and somewhat in need of attention. "I came early because I wanted to look at the place before I made any decisions about it. I did not want to make decisions based only on the bank's description." "What decisions?" He turned his hat slowly in his hands. "That's what I'm trying to figure out." Etta looked at him for a long moment. Then she stepped back from the doorway. "I have coffee on," she said. "You can come in and say what you need to say, and I will say what I need to say, and we can be done with it." "That sounds fair," he said. He left his horse and wagon and followed her inside. The kitchen was the best room in the house. Etta had always kept it that way. The table was scrubbed white. The copper pots hung in order of size. The window above the wash basin faced east so that the morning light came through it clean and bright. Jedediah Rourke stood just inside the door and looked around at all of it with the same careful attention he had given the land, and Etta poured 2 cups of coffee and set them on the table without asking how he took it. He sat across from her and wrapped his hands around the cup, and she noticed that his hands were the hands of a man who worked, not a man who managed other men who worked. The knuckles were scarred. The palms, when he set the cup down, were calloused. "I should tell you," he said, "that I did not know the land had a house on it with someone living in it until the auction was already done. The bank did not mention that. The bank mentioned a farmhouse. They did not mention the farmhouse was occupied." He paused. "I don't know if that changes anything for you. I just thought you should know." Etta wrapped her own hands around her cup. "Did you buy this land to ranch it?" "I bought this land because the bank offered it to me at a price I could afford, and I have been looking for somewhere to put down roots for a long time." He said it plainly, without self-pity. "I'm not a rich man, Mrs. Conley. I am a man who has worked cattle drives for 11 years and saved what he could, and this was the first opportunity that came along that was within what I'd saved." "Then you intend to use it?" "Yes," she nodded once slowly. "And you're here to tell me that the 30 days stands." He looked at her steadily. "I'm here to see the land and have an honest conversation. I haven't decided anything yet beyond that." The coffee sat between them, and the kitchen was quiet, except for the sound of wind against the window glass, and somewhere distant a mockingbird running through its catalog of stolen songs. "My grandfather built this house," Etta said. "He broke this land with a plow and 2 mules in his bare hands. My father put in the orchard on the south slope. My mother planted the rose canes along the fence line. I buried all 3 of them here." She said it without drama, just as information. "My husband Clarence died last year of a fever, and I did not know until after he was gone that he had borrowed against the property without telling me. I am not asking you to feel sorry for me. I'm just telling you the history of what you bought." Jedediah Rourke listened to all of it without interrupting, which Etta noted. "I'm sorry about your family," he said when she finished, "and I'm sorry about your husband." "Are you?" "Yes." He said it without any particular emphasis, but she believed him. There was another silence. Then he said, "I need someone who knows this land, the layout, the water sources, where the good grass runs, which sections flood in a wet spring. I don't know any of that yet. You do." Etta set down her cup. "What are you saying?" He looked at her directly, and she noticed for the first time that his eyes were a particular shade of brown that was almost amber in the morning light. "I'm saying I have a proposition, and I'd like you to hear it before you tell me to go to the devil." Despite herself, the corner of her mouth moved. "I'll hear it." "You stay," he said. "You know the land, you help me learn it, you keep the house running while I get the cattle operation going. In exchange, you keep your roof and your kitchen garden and your family's graves within reach. I'll pay you a fair wage in addition. We draw up a proper agreement in town with the attorney." Etta stared at him. The mockingbird outside sang a phrase that belonged to a sparrow. "You are offering to let me stay," she said slowly, "on the land that was mine." "I know how that sounds," he said, and to his credit he did not look away. "I know it's not a fair situation, and I know it's not my doing that made it unfair, but it's the situation. And within the situation, I'm trying to offer you something better than 30 days and the road." She stood up from the table and walked to the window and looked out at the south slope where the apple trees her father had planted 20 years ago were just beginning to show their first pale blossoms. She thought about the graves under the live oaks. She thought about the road and what lay down it. She thought about her choices, which were not abundant. She turned around. "Say please," she said. He blinked. "I beg your pardon. You heard me, Mr. Rourke. Say please and mean it." Something shifted in his expression. It wasn't amusement, exactly, though there was something in it that wanted to be. It was more like recognition, as if he had just discovered that the territory he'd ridden into was considerably more interesting than the maps had led him to believe. He stood up from the table. He looked at her across the kitchen with its hanging copper pots and its morning light and its history built into every board and beam. "Mrs. Conley," he said, Would you please consider staying on at this property under the terms I've described? She watched him. She watched him the way she might watch a sky that could go either way, toward rain or toward clearing. You meant it, she said. Yes, he said. I did. She looked at him for one more moment. Then she nodded. Then I'll stay, she said. And we'll go into town and see the attorney and do this properly. And if at any point the terms stop being fair, I will tell you so plainly and directly. I would expect nothing less, he said. He almost smiled when he said it, and Etta Conley, who had not had cause to almost smile in a very long time, felt something small and warm and cautious stir somewhere behind her ribs. She ignored it because she was a practical woman, but she noted it. The attorney in the town of Harlan was a narrow man named Aldous Pitcher, who smelled of pipe tobacco, and wore his spectacles at the end of his nose as if they were trying to escape his face. He read over the terms that Etta and Jedediah Rourke presented to him with the meticulous thoroughness of a man who found fine print genuinely interesting, and he added 2 clauses that Etta insisted upon and one that Rourke insisted upon. And by the end of the afternoon, the agreement was signed and witnessed and filed, and Etta Conley had a legal right to remain in the house where she had been born. She walked out of the attorney's office and stood on the wooden boardwalk of Harlan's Main Street with the document folded in her hands, and she felt something that she was not immediately able to identify. It was not happiness exactly, and it was not safety exactly, but it was something in the neighborhood of both, a kind of solid ground under her feet where there had been none. Rourke came out behind her and stood beside her on the boardwalk. The afternoon sun was coming down long and low over the rooftops to the west, turning everything the color of old brass. The feed merchant's still open, he said. I need to put in an order if I'm going to get the cattle side started before summer. Jensen's has the best prices, she said. The other one, Halcomb's, he skews his weights when he thinks he can get away with it. Rourke looked at her. Good to know. There's a lot you're going to need to know, she said. The creek on the north section runs shallow in August and the cattle will push toward the south pasture. The fence on the east property line needs mending in about 4 places. The soil near the old horse paddock is still sweet and good for feed grain if you want to plant any. And the Williams family 2 miles west will be civil to you as long as you don't let your cattle drift onto their land, but if you do, Harmon Williams will take it as a personal affront and hold it for years. Rourke had been watching her as she spoke, and she stopped when she realized it. What? She said. You know this land the way some people know a piece of music, he said. Every note of it. She looked away, down the street toward where a pair of horses stood tied outside the saloon. It's my home, she said simply, or it was. It still is, he said. She looked back at him sharply, expecting the condescension of false comfort, but his face held only the same directness she was beginning to identify as his natural manner. You put it in the agreement, he reminded her. She had. She had insisted on language that named her residence rights specifically. Yes, she said, I did. Then it's your home, he said. That part isn't complicated. She did not know what to do with that, so she tucked the document more firmly under her arm and said, Jensen's feed is 2 blocks north on the left side of the street. I'll show you. She walked, and he fell into step beside her, and neither of them remarked on how naturally that happened. The first 2 weeks were a negotiation in the practical sense. Rourke had been sleeping in his wagon, which Etta considered unnecessarily Spartan, and on the 4th day she told him so. The bunkhouse has a good roof and a working stove, she said over the breakfast she had begun making for both of them without ever quite deciding to. You'll sleep better and work better, and there's no sense in being miserable about the roof when there's a roof available. He looked at her with that measuring expression she was getting to know. You don't mind that? I mind seeing someone sleep in a wagon when there's a bunkhouse 20 yards away. I mind inefficiency. She set a plate in front of him. Don't read anything into it, it's practical. Practical, he repeated, and there was something in how he said it. Yes, she said firmly. He moved into the bunkhouse. He was up before dawn every day, which Etta respected. She was up before dawn herself, and there was a rhythm to it that she hadn't expected, the kitchen light coming on, and then, a few minutes later, the lantern in the bunkhouse window, and then the sound of him moving in the yard. She learned his habits the way you learn the habits of the land, through steady observation over time. He drank his coffee black and very strong. He worked straight through the middle of the day, even in heat that would put lesser men under a tree, but he also stopped work at an honest hour and did not push past the point of usefulness. He talked to his horse, a large bay named Samuel, with what could only be described as genuine conversational respect. He was not a man who wasted words, but when he used them they tended to mean precisely what he said. She taught him the land over those first weeks, and it was the strangest experience of her life, because she had never had to translate into words a knowledge that had always lived in her body. She showed him where the underground spring pushed up near the limestone shelf on the north slope, and how to read the grass color to know when the soil was running thin, and the way the deer trails mapped the natural corridors between water and shelter. He listened with his whole attention, asking questions that were careful and specific, never pretending to know something he didn't. One afternoon in the third week, they were walking the fence line on the eastern property boundary, checking the places she had mentioned needed repair, and she was showing him how her father had set the posts at an angle to better resist wind pull, when she noticed that he was not looking at the fence post. He was looking at her hands where she demonstrated the technique, and his expression was one she had not seen on him before. It was open in a way he usually wasn't. She stopped talking. He looked up and met her eyes, and neither of them said anything for a moment. Then he said, "Your father knew what he was doing." "He did," she said. "He knew everything about this land." "You carry all of it," he said. "Everything he knew, you carry it." She looked away at the hills, which were green now with the genuine arrival of spring. "I suppose I do," she said. "I never thought about it that way." "It's a considerable thing," he said, "to carry that much." She turned back to the fence post and began explaining the rest of the technique, but something had shifted slightly, like a door that has been opened an inch and lets in a thin, bright line of new air. The trouble came, as trouble in Harlan County often did, in the form of a man named Boyd Sutton. Boyd Sutton owned the largest cattle operation in the county and had a long-established habit of treating the surrounding smaller landowners as inconveniences to be managed rather than neighbors to be respected. He had tried twice to buy the Conley land from Clarence, and Clarence had refused both times, and Sutton had not forgotten it. When he heard that the land had been sold at foreclosure to an outsider, he rode over one afternoon in May with two of his hands flanking him like punctuation, and he found Etta and Jedediah Rourke repairing the section of fence on the north slope. "Rourke," Sutton said from horseback, looking down at them both. He was a big man who had run to fat in the last decade without surrendering his confidence, and he wore his wealth in the particular aggressive way of men who had fought hard to get it and needed everyone to know. "Heard you were getting settled in." Rourke looked up from the fence wire he was stringing. He did not stand immediately, which Etta noticed. He finished what he was doing with the wire, set it properly, and then stood unhurried. "Sutton," he said, "word travels. It does out here. I like to know my neighbors." Sutton's eyes moved to Etta with the specific kind of look that she had always disliked, the look that assessed value and found the total acceptable. "Mrs. Conley, still on the place, I see." "Still on the place," she said pleasantly. "Rourke," Sutton said, redirecting, "I'm going to be neighborly and tell you that there's a grazing easement on the north section of this property that's been in place for 8 years. My cattle have run through that corridor every spring drive. I'd hate for you to be unaware of that and have some kind of unfortunate misunderstanding." Rourke looked at him evenly. "There's no easement recorded on this property. I had the title examined before I purchased it." Sutton smiled the way powerful men smile when they want you to know they are humoring you. "It was a gentleman's agreement with Conley. Doesn't need to be recorded." "If it's not recorded," Rourke said, "it doesn't exist in law. And I'll be running my own cattle on the north section starting next month. I'd appreciate you routing your spring drive elsewhere." The smile didn't leave Sutton's face, but it changed character. "You're new here," he said. "You don't know how things work." "I expect I'll learn," Rourke said. Sutton looked at him for a moment, then at Etta, and then he turned his horse and rode back the way he had come, his two hands falling in behind him. Etta watched them go. Then she said, "He's going to cause trouble." "Probably," Rourke said. He picked up the wire stretcher again. "Will you hand me that next section?" She handed it to him. "You're not concerned enough to be aware of it," he said, working the wire. "Not so concerned that I'm going to lose sleep." He glanced at her. "Should I be?" "Sutton has money and influence and the sheriff's ear," she said. "He doesn't usually come at a problem directly." "Around it." Rourke absorbed this. "What did he do to your husband?" She was quiet for a moment. "Nothing that could be proven. Clarence's debt at the bank, I always wondered how it got there so fast and so large. Clarence liked to gamble, but not that extravagantly. Some debts," she said carefully, "have help accumulating." Rourke set down the wire stretcher and looked at her fully. "You think Sutton engineered the foreclosure?" "I think it's possible. I can't prove it." She met his eyes. "I thought you should know." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the hills. Then he said, "Thank you for telling me." "You're on the land now," she said. "What happens to it affects you." "It affects us both," he said, and went back to the fence. But Etta stood still for a moment longer, the word "us" sitting somewhere in her chest in a way she had not anticipated. The night of the first genuine spring rain came at the end of May, and it came hard. Etta was up at 2 in the morning, hearing the particular sound that meant the lean-to roof over the north end of the vegetable garden was in trouble, and she was pulling on her boots in the dark when she heard Rourke already moving in the yard, already ahead of the problem. She went out with a lantern and found him bracing the lean-to frame in the driving rain, soaked through, working the problem methodically. She held the lantern without being asked, and they worked together in the dark, and the rain with the unspoken coordination of people who have spent enough time in the same space to understand each other's movements. When the lean-to was secured and they came back through the kitchen door, dripping water across the clean floor, they stood in the lamplight looking at each other, and Etta began to laugh. It surprised her. She hadn't laughed like that, spontaneously and without effort, in longer than she could precisely remember. He looked at her in the lamplight for a moment, and then he began to laugh too, and the kitchen was warm with it. "Your garden is secure," he said, pushing his wet hair back from his forehead. "Our garden," she said, and then stopped, surprised at herself. He was quiet, and his expression was something she didn't have a ready name for. "I should get dry things," she said, practical again. "Yes," he agreed. She went to get dry things, and he went back to the bunkhouse, and she sat on the edge of her bed in the quiet afterward and pressed her hand to her sternum where that small, warm, cautious thing had grown, overnight and without her permission, into something considerably less small. She thought about Clarence. She thought about what it meant that her marriage had been one of those quiet arrangements of mutual usefulness and occasional kindness that had satisfied her needs without particularly moving her heart. She had told herself at 22 that love was a luxury, the kind of thing in storybooks, and that a good practical arrangement was what a sensible woman built her life around. She wondered, in the quiet of her bedroom with the rain slowing outside, whether she had been entirely right about that. June arrived, and with it the first of Rourke's cattle, a modest initial herd of 30 head that he had purchased from a rancher up near Uvalde. Etta watched from the porch as they came up the drive, and there was a complicated satisfaction in watching the land fill up with life again the way it had been before Clarence's illness and the long, slow decline. Rourke hired one hand, a young man of 20 named Tomás Vega, whose family had been in the hill country longer than any American settler, and who knew cattle and horses with an expertise that immediately earned Rourke's genuine respect. Etta had known Tomás since he was a boy. She made sure he was paid fairly and fed well, which he acknowledged with a formal courtesy that she returned. The three of them fell into the rhythms of the place. Etta kept the house and the kitchen garden and managed the accounts, which was a role she had taken on without discussion, because she was better with numbers than Rourke was, and he was honest enough to acknowledge it. He brought the cattle ledgers to her at the kitchen table in the evenings, and she went over them with him. And these evenings became the best part of her day before she fully understood that they were. They talked about everything, about the land and the cattle and the weather and what crops to plant, about Harlan County's history and the politics of water rights and the new railroad spur that was coming through 30 miles south. But also about other things, personal things, the kind that come out gradually between people who are spending their lives in close proximity and have begun to trust each other with something more than practical information. He told her about County Clare in Ireland, and being 12 years old on a coffin ship in the middle of the Atlantic, and arriving in Boston in 1859 with nothing but a name and a willingness to work. About drifting west in stages, St. Louis and Kansas City and Abilene, following the cattle trade up the trails. About 11 years of being nowhere in particular and wanting, quietly and persistently, somewhere to be. She told him about her mother singing at the kitchen window and her father's hands on the plow. She told him about the way the hill country smelled after rain, like crushed cedar and wet limestone, and something green and alive underneath. She told him about Clarence, not with bitterness, but honestly, the way she had cared for him and the ways in which they had not quite reached each other, the loneliness inside a marriage that looks ordinary from the outside. She told him these things and watched him listen, and she thought that she had never spoken them to anyone before, because there had been no one who would receive them in this particular way, with this particular quality of attention that made her feel as if what she said mattered precisely as much as it was said. One evening in late June, she looked up from the cattle ledger to find him watching her in the lamplight with an expression that her body recognized before her mind did, and she felt the warmth of it travel from her face all the way down through her, and she looked back down at the numbers and could not make them add up correctly for the rest of the hour. Boyd Sutton made his next move in early July. He filed a claim with the county land office alleging a boundary dispute on the north section of the property, citing survey records that Etta had never seen, and that did not match her family's original land grant. The claim would, if successful, subtract 40 acres from the property's north corner, which was exactly the 40 acres through which the Spring Creek ran. Without the creek water on that section, a cattle operation on the north pasture became significantly harder to sustain. Etta and Rourke drove to Harlan to see Aldous Pitcher about it. The attorney spread the relevant documents across his desk and spent a long time looking at them through his nose and spectacles. He hummed and tapped his fingers and made small sounds that communicated consultation. Finally, he looked up. "The survey Sutton cites is dated 1870, Pitcher said. "Your original land grant from the Republic of Texas, Mrs. Conley, is dated 1846. In my professional opinion, and I say this with some confidence, the original grant takes precedence." However, he held up a finger. "Sutton has Judge Harlow's ear, and Judge Harlow has been known to find surprising things in property cases where Sutton is a party." "What are our options?" Rourke said. "You can contest the claim, which will go before Judge Harlow in about 3 months. You can attempt to have it heard in district court rather than county court, which requires filing in San Antonio. Or you can do both simultaneously and hope that the district court moves faster." "File in both," Etta said immediately. Rourke looked at her. "That costs more." "I know what it costs," she said. "The water on that section is the difference between this operation being viable and not being viable. You know that as well as I do." He held her gaze for a moment, and something passed between them that was about more than water rights and survey records. It was about partnership, and about what they were both fighting for, and about the fact that in the weeks since his wagon first pulled up her drive, the words "mine" and "yours" had gradually, almost without either of them noticing, become ours. "File in both," he said to Pitcher. Pitcher nodded and began making notes. On the way home in the wagon, the evening sun dropping behind the hills and the air smelling of summer grass and warm earth, they rode in comfortable silence for a while. The road wound through cedar breaks and over a limestone ridge, where the whole of the valley spread out below them in the long golden light. "Etta," he said. She looked at him, and something in the way he said her name, just her name, not Mrs. Conley, made her breath catch. He was looking at the road, then he looked at her, and then he seemed to make a decision. "I want to tell you something," he said, "and I don't want you to feel that it changes the arrangement or puts any kind of pressure on the situation. Because I understand what the situation is, and I understand that you have reasons to be careful about a great many things. And I don't want to add to what you're already carrying." "Say it," she said. Her voice was steady, which took some effort. "I think about you," he said, not in an unclear way, very clearly. More than is probably practical. He looked at the road again. "I think about you in the evenings when I'm in the bunkhouse, and in the mornings when I see the kitchen light come on. I think about what you say afterward when we've finished talking. I thought you should know that. Not because I'm expecting anything in return, but because I'm not a man who's comfortable pretending to something he doesn't feel, or pretending not to feel something that he does." The valley spread below them in the gold light, and a hawk turned slow circles above the cedar ridge, and the horses moved steadily forward. Etta looked at her hands in her lap. "I am careful," she said. "You're right about that." "I know. Clarence didn't hurt me," she said, wanting to be precise about this. "He was a decent enough man and he meant well. But I spent 6 years being someone's practical arrangement, and I know the difference now between being valued and being useful. And I know I can sometimes confuse the two in my own heart, and I want to be sure before I say anything about my heart that I am not confusing them." Rourke was quiet, letting her talk. "But I think," she said slowly, "the way you put weight onto ice you're not certain will hold. That what I feel when I look at you has nothing to do with usefulness." He was very still. "And I think," she continued, "that the evenings when we sit at the kitchen table are the best hours of my day, and that I am more myself with you than I have been with anyone in a very long time." She paused. "I think you should know that." He turned to look at her, and what was in his face was not triumphant or relieved or any of the things she might have expected. It was careful and warm and entirely serious, the way he was about everything that mattered to him. "Etta," he said, and again just her name was enough. "Don't rush it," she said. Let's just know it for now, and let it grow at the pace it wants to grow." "Yes," he said, "that's the right way." They rode the rest of the way home in a silence that was full of everything, and the valley light turned from gold to purple and the first stars appeared above the cedar hills, and Etta Conley felt, for the first time in a very long time, as if the ground under her feet was solid all the way down. July and August moved through the hill country in the way of Texas summers, hot and certain, and ungoverned by human preference. Rourke hired a second hand, an older man named Fletcher who had been foreman on a ranch outside of Fredericksburg for 12 years before the ranch sold, and left him without a position. Fletcher was 50, raw-boned and brown as saddle leather, and he said almost nothing that wasn't directly applicable to the care and management of cattle, which Rourke found entirely satisfactory. The herd had grown to 62 head by the middle of August, and the north pasture was carrying them well. The Spring Creek, still legally theirs while the court matter wound its way through 2 sets of bureaucratic machinery, ran low but steady, and Rourke had built a secondary tank on the south section to ease the pressure on the water. He worked beside his men, not above them, and Etta watched this, and it told her things about him that she would have taken much longer to learn another way. She watched the way Tomás Vega, who had been wary at first with the wariness of a young man who had seen too many Anglo landowners treat Mexican vaqueros as less than human, slowly came to trust Rourke. She watched the quality of that trust grow over the summer, and she thought that a man who could earn that kind of trust deserved a great deal of credence. The evenings were hers and Rourke's, and they were unhurried. She learned to read his silences the way she read the land, and he learned to read hers, and sometimes they sat on the porch after supper without saying anything for long stretches, just watching the summer dark come on over the hills, comfortable in the particular way that only comes from genuine ease with another person. One August evening she brought out a second quilt because the nights had started their slow shift toward fall, and she spread it over both their laps on the porch, and he looked at her when she did it, and she looked back at him, and the moment had a weight and a sweetness that she did not try to name. "Tell me something you've never told anyone," she said. "What about it?" "I was afraid," he said, "every day for the first year on the cattle drives, not of the physical work, afraid that I would never belong anywhere, that I would spend my whole life being a man moving through other people's places without ever having one of my own." He was looking at the hills. "I watched ranchers with their families and their land and their roots, and I felt the absence of it like a cold place inside me. And now," she said, he turned to look at her. "It's warmer," he said. She reached across the quilt and put her hand over his, and his hand turned under hers and held it, and they sat like that in the warm dark with the crickets and the distant calling of an owl, and it was one of the most complete moments of Etta's life. The district court in San Antonio moved faster than anyone had expected. In the second week of September, Aldous Pitcher rode out to the farm with a document that he presented with visible satisfaction, the satisfaction of a man who had been right about the law and was gratified to have a record of it. The district court had ruled in favor of the 1846 land grant. The boundary claim was dismissed. The north section was unambiguously and conclusively theirs. Boyd Sutton apparently took the ruling with poor grace, according to Harlan's collective gossip network, which Etta had access to through her friend Clara Marsh, who ran the general store with her husband. Sutton had, rumor held, thrown a very good hat across his office and used language that caused his housekeeper to remove herself to the garden until the storm had passed. Etta told Rourke this over supper, and he looked at her with a wry expression. "I feel badly about the hat," he said. "I don't," she said. "No," he agreed. "Neither do I." They looked at each other across the supper table and both of them smiled, and the kitchen was warm and the lamp burned between them on the table, and Etta thought that she was going to have to stop calling this cautious, that what she felt for this man had long since moved past caution into something else entirely, something clear and settled and sure. After supper, when the dishes were done and Rourke was banking the kitchen stove, she said, "Jedediah." He turned from the stove. It was the first time she had used his first name, and they both knew it. She saw it register in his eyes. "The land is safe," she said. "Sutton is done, at least for now. You have your cattle operation going, and the accounts are solid, and we're going into fall in good standing." She folded the dishcloth carefully. "All the practical reasons for us to be what we are have been satisfied." "Yes," he said, watching her. "So I want to say something that isn't practical at all," she said. "And I want to say it plainly because I think you have earned plain speaking, and so have I." She met his eyes across the kitchen. "I love you. I have been in the process of loving you for months, and I have been careful about it and patient with it, and I have let it grow at the pace it wanted to grow, the way I said. And I think it is fully grown now, and I don't want to not say it anymore." The kitchen was very quiet. He crossed it in 3 steps, and when he took her face in his hands, she felt the calluses of his palms against her cheeks and the warmth of him. 11 years of the outdoors and all the cold, lonely years before, and she had never in her life felt so precisely met. "I love you," he said. "I have loved you since you told me to say please and mean it, and I have been patient because you asked me to be, and because you were right to ask." She laughed, just a breath of it, because she had not expected him to go back that far. "I meant it," he said, "that day in the kitchen. More than you knew." "I know that now," she said. He kissed her, and it was slow and warm and entirely certain, the way he did everything that mattered. When he pulled back, his hands were still on her face, and her hands had come up to hold his wrists, and they looked at each other in the lamplight of the kitchen where she had made coffee for him that first morning, what felt like a different lifetime ago. "Marry me," he said. "Not for practical reasons, for this." She looked at him and did not hesitate. "Yes," she said. "Jedediah, yes." The wedding was in October, which is the finest month in the Texas Hill Country. when the sumac runs red on the ridges, and the air has a new sharpness to it that makes everything feel more itself. Aldous Pitcher, who turned out to be a justice of the peace as well as an attorney, performed the ceremony on the farmhouse porch in the presence of Tomás Vega, Fletcher, Clara Marsh and her husband Dennis, and Reverend Aldred from the church in Harlan, who came more out of friendly curiosity than professional necessity. Etta wore her best dress, which was blue-gray, the color of hills in early morning, and she braided her hair the way her mother had taught her, pinned with 2 small combs that had been her mother's. Rourke wore a clean dark suit that he had purchased in San Antonio on the last trip there, and he stood on the porch of the house that had been Etta's family's for 3 generations, and said his vows with the same directness he brought to everything, looking at her the entire time, and she said hers back to him the same way. Tomás made a comment afterward, quietly to Fletcher, that this was the only wedding he'd been to where both people looked like they actually knew what they were agreeing to. Fletcher, who had been to exactly 1 wedding in his life, said that seemed right to him. Clara Marsh brought a chocolate cake from the general store's kitchen, which was a considerable gift, and they ate it on the porch in the October afternoon with the hill country going gold and red around them. When everyone had gone and the porch was quiet and the evening star had come up over the eastern hills, Rourke put his arm around Etta's shoulders and she leaned into his side, and the farm lay around them in the twilight. The fields and the orchard and the bunkhouse and the fences, everything her family had built and everything they were building, all of it theirs now in every sense. "I should tell you something," he said. "What?" "The first morning," he said, "when I drove up and looked at the house before you opened the door, I was looking at the porch and the garden and the hills, and I thought this is the most beautiful piece of land I have ever seen in my life, and I thought whoever lived here must have loved it very much." She was quiet for a moment. "And then you opened the door," he said, "and I thought, there she is. That's who loved it." Etta pressed her face briefly against his shoulder. "You did not think that on the first morning," she said. "I thought something very close to it," he said. "I thought, this woman is not going to make this easy, and I am extremely glad of that." She laughed, and he laughed against her hair, and the evening came on quiet and whole around them. The fall was busy in the productive way of farm seasons, the way that leaves you tired at the end of every day with the good kind of tired that comes from honest work. Etta and Rourke worked the place together with Tomás and Fletcher, getting the cattle ready for winter, laying in stores, cutting firewood on the ridge above the spring, mending the sections of fence that needed it before the ground froze hard. And in the evenings, they had the kitchen and the lamp and each other, and the conversations that went where they would, and the particular private tenderness that grows between 2 people who have decided to give themselves to each other without reservation. She told him things she had never said out loud. He told her things he had never expected to have anyone to tell. They disagreed sometimes sharply about practical matters and occasionally about larger ones, and neither of them found the disagreements threatening, because both of them knew by now that the other was not going anywhere. One November evening, Rourke came in from the north pasture in a mood she had learned to read as something is on his mind and he is deciding whether to say it, and she finished the bread she was shaping and washed her hands and sat down at the table and waited. He sat across from her and turned his hat in his hands. "Sutton came by today," he said. She was still. "What did he want?" "He made me an offer on the north section. The section we just won in court." "Yes. What did you tell him?" Rourke set the hat on the table. "I told him it wasn't for sale. He accepted that." Not gracefully, Rourke paused. "He said something about, he said you had always been above yourself." Used different words. I won't repeat them. Etta felt the particular cold anger that comes not from insult to oneself but from insult to something deeper than self. She felt it, and she let it settle before she spoke. "What did you say to that?" she asked. Rourke looked at her steadily. "I told him that if he ever said anything about my wife that I'd have to repeat to her with an apology, he would find my patience with him entirely exhausted." and that my patience up to this point should not be mistaken for tolerance of anything he'd done or said, but for the preference for settling matters lawfully. He paused. And then I told him to get off the land. She looked at him across the kitchen table. He got off, Rourke said. Good, she said. Something in her chest, a thing she had not known was wound tight, released. Not because she could not have fought that battle herself. She had fought a great many battles herself, and she was not afraid to continue doing so. But there was something in being fought for, genuinely and without drama, that she had not known she had been missing. He'll make another move eventually, she said. Probably. Rourke reached across the table and put his hand over hers. We'll handle it when it comes. She turned her hand over and held his. Yes, she said, we will. Sutton did make another move in December, but it was a smaller and pettier one than they'd anticipated. A complaint to the county about the fence line on the road easement, which Pitcher dispatched, with a single letter citing 3 separate statutes. After that, Sutton seemed to recalibrate, perhaps recognizing that they were not going to be dislodged, that the combination of Etta's knowledge of the land and its legal history and Rourke's steady practical competence and his complete disinclination to be intimidated was not a combination that yielded to pressure. He remained a presence in the county, a man to be aware of. But his attention seemed to shift, in the way that water redirects when it finds a surface too solid to erode. Winter in the hill country was cold but not brutal, and the farmhouse with its good fireplace and its thick walls did what it had always done, kept them comfortable through the short gray days. Rourke proved to be a man who did not mind being indoors during bad weather, which was fortunate, because some men of his type found confinement intolerable. He read, which she had not expected, borrowing books from Clara Marsh's small lending collection and working through them methodically. He played cards with Fletcher and Tamaz on Friday evenings in the bunkhouse, a tradition that apparently involved considerable argument and very small stakes. He repaired things in the barn and the bunkhouse during the days when the weather kept them from outdoor work, and he was inventive about problems, which she admired. She found herself watching him in the evenings and thinking, in a continuous low hum of gratitude that she tried to honor rather than take for granted, that this was what she had not known she was missing. Not just partnership, not just company, but this specific person with his amber eyes and his careful hands and his way of giving his whole attention to whatever was in front of him. She was, she understood, profoundly happy. Not the performed contentment of her first marriage, not the functional satisfaction of surviving. Happy. It was different in kind, not just in degree. In January, she told him she was expecting their first child. She told him at breakfast, simply, the way she did everything, and watched his face while he received the information. She saw the moment it landed. She saw his eyes change. He stood up from the breakfast table and came around to where she was sitting, and he took her face in his hands very gently, the way you hold something extraordinary that you are afraid to break, and he looked at her for a long moment without speaking. "Etta," he said finally. "Yes," she said, smiling at him because she had already done the thinking and arrived at the other side of it and was ready to share the joy. Are you well?" he said. "Perfectly well. It's early yet." He sat down beside her rather than across from her, keeping hold of her hands. He looked at their joined hands, then up at her face. There was a brightness in his expression that she had not seen on him before, not quite, a particular kind of joy that is also something close to terror, because the things that matter most are always a little terrifying. "A child," he said, as if saying it made it more certain. "By August," she said, "if I'm reading it correctly." "Are you scared?" he asked her. She considered honestly. "A little, but not very much." She looked at him. "Are you?" "Yes," he said without hesitation. "Good," she said. "You should be. It means you understand what it is." He laughed, startled, and shook his head and lifted her hands and pressed them briefly to his mouth, and she felt his breath warm against her knuckles. "It means this land passes forward," she said quietly. "That's what my grandfather thought about, and my father, not about themselves on it, but about who would come after." Rourke was looking at her intently. "Is that what you think about?" "I think about it now," she said. Now that I have a reason to. He held her hands a little tighter. The child will know this land the way you know it, he said. You'll see to that. We'll see to it, she corrected. Yes, he said, we will. Spring came back around, the second spring of Rourke's time on the property, and the first spring in which Etta watched it arrive with a future in it rather than just a present. And the difference was the difference between a landscape seen through glass and one felt on your skin. The apple trees bloomed on the south slope again. The rose canes along the fence line put out their first tentative red-green shoots. The creek on the north section, fully and legally theirs now by every measurement that existed, ran high and clear with the snowmelt from higher country to the north. The cattle operation had grown to 90 head in Rourke, and Tamaz drove a first cut to the railhead in Fredericksburg in April, returning with enough money to put the farm on genuinely solid financial footing for the first time in several years. Etta went over the numbers at the kitchen table with the particular satisfaction of a woman who has kept books through lean times and now finds them running in the right direction. She was showing more as April moved toward May, and she was aware of the ranch hands treating her with an exaggerated care that she found both touching and somewhat unnecessary. She told Rourke this, and he said that he'd mentioned to Tamaz that she was not made of glass, and Tamaz had said he knew that, but still, and Rourke had decided to let it be. "You're not going to tell me to slow down either, are you?" she said. It was not a question. "I'm going to note when I think you're overdoing something and let you make your own decisions," he said. "I've met you, I know what you're like." She smiled at him. "Good answer." "I've been practicing," he said. They had found, over the months, a fluency with each other that Etta had not known was possible. She had thought, based on her previous experience, that marriage was a form of permanent negotiation, an ongoing management of two separate people's needs and preferences. What she had not understood was that this friction could be replaced, with the right person, by something more like harmony, not the absence of difference but the presence of a shared language for navigating it. They still disagreed. They were both too plain-spoken and too certain in their opinions for disagreement to be absent. But there was under every disagreement a foundation that neither of them doubted, and that changed the nature of all of it. Tamaz Vega, for his part, had over the year become something between an employee and a younger brother, the kind of relationship that forms between people who work hard and honestly alongside each other. He had a girl in town, the second youngest daughter of a family named Garza who ran a small farm south of Harlan, and he was working up the courage to make his intentions known. Etta took an interest in this situation, with the gentle but persistent interest of a woman who has found her own happiness and wants the people around her to find theirs. "You should go speak to her father," she told him one afternoon when the subject came up in a roundabout way during a conversation about entirely other things. "It is not so simple," Tamaz said. "It is simple," she said. "The other things around it are complicated. The thing itself is simple." He thought about this for several days, apparently, because a week later he told Rourke he needed a Saturday afternoon, and Rourke said to take as much time as he needed. Tamaz came back on Sunday morning glowing with the particular light of a man who has been brave and has been rewarded for it. "Her father said yes," he reported. Etta said, "Of course he did." Rourke looked at her with that expression she had come to know, the one where he was amused by her certainty but also entirely unsurprised by it. "You knew," he said. "I know Rosario Garza," Etta said. "And I know Tamaz. It was obvious." In August, true to her own calculation, Etta delivered a healthy boy in the upstairs bedroom of the farmhouse with the assistance of the doctor from Harlan and the company of Clara Marsh, who had appointed herself useful and had been, in fact, indispensable. Rourke spent most of the labor hours in the yard doing useful tasks in a pattern that Clara later described as a man walking a very fast and purposeful circle, and when the doctor came to the top of the stairs and told him he could come up, he took the stairs 3 at a time. He sat on the edge of the bed, and Etta put the baby in his arms and watched his face. She had thought she knew his face by now in all its moods and weathers. She had not known it in this one. He looked at the baby, the way he had looked at this land on the first morning he had arrived, with a kind of searching, recognizing awe, as if he were finding something he had been looking for without fully knowing he was looking. "He has your eyes," Rourke said, somewhat incoherently because the baby's eyes were the dark blue of all newborns. "He has your chin," Etta said. "God help him," he said. She laughed, exhausted and luminous, and he leaned carefully across the baby and kissed her forehead. They named the boy Callum Francis Rourke. Callum for a great-uncle of Rourke's from County Clare whose name he remembered with particular affection, and Francis for Etta's father. The two names together sounded to Etta like exactly what the boy was, a joining of histories, the old country and the new, and the land that had been the Conleys and was now the Rourkes, and would someday be Callum's. The baptism was in Harlan's church with Reverend Aldred presiding and Tomás Vega and Clara Marsh standing as godparents, and afterward they had a dinner at the farmhouse with more people than the table could comfortably hold. So they moved everything outside into the September afternoon, and it was better that way, more generous and open, matching the feeling in the room. Boyd Sutton did not attend, because he was not invited, and he did not trouble them in that season or the next. Some threats, Etta had learned, retreat not because they are defeated, but because they find no purchase in something solid enough to be impervious to them. She and Rourke had built something solid. Not just the cattle operation or the legal standing or the financial footing, though all of those were solid. They had built a life together in the full sense, with its own gravity and weight, and Sutton's small maneuvers could not find a place to hook into it. That autumn and winter, with Callum in his cradle by the kitchen fireplace, and the hills going gold and then bare and then dusted with the thin snow that came once or twice to the Texas hill country in a cold year, Etta looked at her life from the inside of it and found that it matched, in some deep way, what she had never quite let herself imagine. The house was full of warmth and sound and work, and the particular kind of love that is not diminished by dailiness but deepened by it. Rourke was a father the way he was everything, fully and without reservation. He was up with the baby in the dark hours, not reluctantly but with a patient wakefulness that Etta found so moving she sometimes had to look away from it. He talked to Callum the way he talked to his horse Samuel, as if the talking itself was worthwhile regardless of whether the recipient fully understood it. He told the baby about cattle and the creek and the limestone hills, and the way the light came in the kitchen window in the morning. Etta, listening from across the room, thought that her son was receiving the knowledge of his land almost from birth, the way her father had given it to her, and that Rourke was doing this deliberately and lovingly without ever making a point of it. In the second spring, Tomás Vega married his Rosario Garza in a ceremony at the church that filled the pews with the entire extended Garza family, which was considerable, and Etta and Rourke attended with Callum, who slept through the ceremony with the enviable equanimity of the very young. Rosario was a woman of 20 who carried herself with a quiet authority that Etta recognized and respected, and she moved into a small house in town, and Tomás rode out to the ranch every morning with an energy that Rourke noted was different from his previous energy, a more grounded and purposeful thing. "Love does that," Etta told Rourke when he remarked on it. He looked at her. "Does what?" "Gives you more to work for, more to come home to." She shifted Callum, who was awake now and interested in a fence post on her hip. "You know that." He did know that. He thought about what his days had been before, the purposeful but directionless motion of a man moving through other people's places, the good honest work that nonetheless ended each day in a bunkhouse that was not his and a country that was not his and a future that was not quite attached to anything. He thought about what they were now, each day shaped by this land and this woman and this boy and the particular gravity of a life fully rooted. "I know that," he said. She reached across with her free hand and took his hand and held it for a moment, and then Callum made a commanding noise about the fence post, and they both laughed, and she set the boy down to investigate what he was clearly convinced was extremely significant. The herd reached 120 head by the following spring, which was 1881, 3 years after Rourke had driven his wagon up Etta's drive with a foreclosure deed and a proposal she had accepted only on her own terms. The ranch was profitable, the accounts were in order, the land was theirs in every legal and practical sense. More than that, it was home. Not in the retrospective way that places become home after you have been in them long enough, but in the immediate and daily way, the way that means every morning you wake up in it is a morning you have chosen it again. Fletcher retired that winter, his knees finally conceding to the decades of cattle work. He had family in Careville and went there, and Rourke paid him out fairly, and with a bonus that Fletcher received with the stoic gratitude of a man who has not often been treated fairly and is moved by it more than he can easily express. Tomas had by then grown into a genuine foreman, capable and steady, and he hired 2 younger men under his own authority, which Rourke endorsed without micromanagement. Etta found, in that 3rd year, that the shape of her days had a richness she wanted to capture in some way, to make permanent as a record. She began writing in a journal that she kept in the kitchen, not formally but steadily, recording the day's work and the season's changes and the small events that accumulate into a life. She wrote about Callum learning to walk, which he did with the determined, lurching enthusiasm of someone who has decided that falling is an acceptable cost of progress. She wrote about the cattle and the creek and the apple harvest and the look of the hills at different hours. She wrote about Rourke, not every day but often enough that reading back through the journal would tell someone, she thought, exactly who he was and what he meant to her, in the specific and honest way that mattered. She was writing in the journal one October evening when Rourke came in from outside and saw what she was doing, and he looked at the journal with curiosity. "What do you write?" he asked. "Everything," she said. He sat across from her. "May I?" she considered. Then she slid the journal across the table to him. He read slowly, the way he did things that mattered to him. She watched him read, watched his face as he moved through the pages, and when he looked up his eyes were bright with something that was too large to name. "Etta," he said. "Yes. This is—" He paused, the journal in his hands, looking at her with something that was almost loss, almost reverence, almost joy. "This is what I was looking for, all those years moving. This is what I was trying to find." She looked at him across the kitchen table. "I know," she said. "I was looking for it too. I just didn't know I was looking because I thought I was already in it." He reached across and gave her back the journal and then kept hold of her hand. "We have it now," he said. "We do," she agreed. In the spring of 1882, Etta told him she was expecting again. She told him in the same way she had told him about Callum, simply and at breakfast, and his face did the same thing it had done the first time, that particular bright, terrified joy, and she understood that he was not someone who would ever receive this news as ordinary, that every time it would move him the same way, and she loved him for that as thoroughly as she loved him for anything. "Another summer baby," he said. "September this time, I think." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. Callum, who was 2 years old and deeply interested in his own breakfast, ignored them with the total focus of a toddler confronting porridge. "You're well," Rourke said. "Perfectly well." She looked at him. "Are you going to worry?" "Yes," he said. "I'm going to worry in a controlled and non-intrusive way." "That's an acceptable compromise," she said. He was as good as his word, which she appreciated. He noticed when she was tired and did not remark on it in a way that made her feel managed. He took on more of the physical outdoor work without being asked, and without making a ceremony of the adjustment. He was, in this as in everything, someone who paid attention and acted on what he saw without requiring acknowledgement for doing so. The baby came in September as she had predicted, a girl this time, born in the same upstairs bedroom as her brother with the same doctor and the same Clara Marsh in attendance. She was dark-haired and furious about her arrival in a way that made the doctor laugh. Rourke held her in the bedroom with the evening light coming through the window, and she looked up at him with the absolute moral authority of the very newly born, and he looked back at her with complete capitulation. They named her me Francis Rourke. Francis again for Etta's father carried forward in the feminine form. Me for the month in which the apple trees had bloomed that first spring, the spring when everything had begun, which felt right to both of them. Callum, presented with his sister, studied her for a long, serious moment and then announced that she was small. Rourke told him she would not always be small. Callum accepted this information and moved on to more pressing concerns, which at 2 years old were primarily related to his toy horse. The ranch, by the end of 1882, had a settled feeling that went deeper than financial stability. It had the feeling of permanence, not the rigid, unchanging permanence of something frozen, but the living permanence of something rooted. The way the live oaks at the southwest corner of the property had been rooted for longer than anyone alive could remember, growing and changing season by season, but fixed in the earth in a way that bent to storms without breaking. Etta went one afternoon in November, with Callum on her back and me in her arms, to the family graves under those live oaks. The dates on the stones were clear. Her grandfather's stone, her grandmother's stone, her parents' stones. Clarence's stone, smaller and plainer, which she had put up herself with what money she had at the time. She stood among them in the November afternoon and felt the continuity of the place moving through her the way the deep water moved through the limestone under her feet. Not mournfully, but with the full weight of it, the love and the loss and the going forward. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Rourke walking up from the direction of the barn. He had come looking for her, she realized, had found the house empty and known where she would be. He came and stood beside her and said nothing, which was exactly right, and she leaned her shoulder briefly against his and he put his arm around her, careful of me sleeping in the crook of her elbow. After a while she said, "My grandfather would have liked you. Because I work, because you mean what you say," she said. He valued that above almost everything. Rourke was quiet, looking at the oldest stone. "I'm glad he built what he built," he said, "so it was here for you to have." "And for us to have," she said. "Yes," he agreed, "for all of us." Callum, from his position on her back, said something definitive about a bird he could see in the live oak above them. Rourke reached back and patted the boy's boot, and the boy said something equally definitive about the boot, and Etta began to laugh, softly, in the November afternoon among her family's graves and her living family around her. The spring of 1883 brought a development that surprised them both pleasantly. Aldous Pitcher, the attorney and justice of the peace, came out to the farm one afternoon in April with a document and a manner of barely concealed satisfaction. The document was a report from the county land office, confirming that Boyd Sutton had sold his operation and was removing himself from Harlan County entirely. The official reason was a business opportunity in Dallas. The rumored reason, which Pitcher conveyed with lawyerly restraint, was that a consortium of smaller landowners whom Sutton had spent 15 years pressuring had engaged a San Antonio attorney to pursue a coordinated legal challenge to 6 separate easement claims that Sutton had never properly documented. The cost of defending all 6 simultaneously had apparently recalibrated Sutton's view of Harlan County's hospitality. Etta received this news at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a measured expression. Then she said, "Good." Pitcher seemed to feel this covered it adequately. He had his own coffee and they discussed other matters, an easement of their own regarding the road to the north section that needed legal tidying, and by the time he left the late afternoon was gold on the hills and Rourke was coming in from the east pasture with Tamaz. Etta told him about Sutton at supper. He ate a bite of beef and cornbread and considered it. "Overreached," he said finally. "Consistently and for years," she agreed. He assumed that being the largest meant being permanent. He forgot that enough smaller things, if they work together, add up to more than one large thing. Rourke looked at her over his supper plate. "That's very nicely put." "I've been thinking about it for 5 years," she said. "I've had time to phrase it." He smiled at her, that full, genuine smile that she had first seen in pieces before it arrived complete, and she thought that she would never entirely get used to it, the way it changed his face, and that she did not want to get used to it, that the continued pleasure of it was one of the reliable joys of her life. Callum knocked over his cup of milk. Everyone redirected. The years that followed were the years of building, not in the dramatic sense of crisis and resolution, but in the quiet accumulating sense of a life that knows what it is and grows steadily into more of itself. Rourke expanded the herd to 160 head and built a proper bunkhouse with room for 4 hands. He put up a new barn on the north section, closer to the spring creek. He mended the orchard fence and learned from Etta the particular attention that apple trees require in the Texas hill country, the pruning and the water management, and the way you read the bark to know what's happening underneath. Etta's kitchen garden grew to encompass 2 full plots, and she began selling surplus produce to Clara Marsh at the general store, which Clara sold to the town, and which represented a small but not insignificant contribution to the household accounts. She also began to write, occasionally, for the San Antonio newspaper, brief practical pieces about farming in the hill country that attracted more readers than the editor expected and which he asked her to continue. She wrote them at the kitchen table in the evenings when the children were in bed, and Rourke read each one when she finished it with the same attention he gave the cattle ledgers, which was his highest form of concentration. "You write the way you talk," he told her once. "Directly. No wasted words." "Is that good? People read it," he said. "That answers the question." She rolled her eyes at him, which was an expression he had long since learned to interpret as affection. Callum grew into a serious and curious boy who followed his father and Tamaz around the ranch with the focused observation of someone taking careful inventory, and who followed his mother around the kitchen and the garden with equal focus. He had both of them in him, Etta thought, the outdoor competence and the domestic intelligence, and he would be, in time, exactly the kind of person you needed to run a place like this. Me was different, louder and more immediate, with a laugh that arrived without warning and filled whatever room she was in. She had her father's amber eyes and her mother's absolute certainty, and she was 3 years old when she informed Rourke that his horse Samuel was her friend now, and Rourke, who had discussed the matter with Samuel and received no objection, allowed this. One winter evening, with the fire burning and both children asleep and the house quiet around them, Etta and Rourke sat on the settle before the fire in what she had come to think of as their hour, the hour that belonged to no one and nothing else, no accounts or ledgers or planning or work, just the two of them and the fire and the comfortable spaciousness of a life they had chosen and kept choosing every day. He said, "Are you happy?" She looked at him, surprised by the question only because he asked it so rarely, not because he didn't care about the answer but because she thought he usually felt he could read it. "What's making you ask?" she said. "I think about it sometimes," he said, "whether what I hoped to give you when this started matches what you actually have." "What you hoped to give me," she said slowly. "What was that?" He looked at the fire. "You told me you knew the difference between being valued and being useful. I wanted what I offered you to be the first thing. Not a consolation, not a practical arrangement. I wanted you to be," he stopped, gathered his words. "I wanted you to be as at home in this life as you are in this land, not just surviving it, actually at home." She was quiet for a moment, feeling the warmth of the fire and the weight of what he'd said. "I am at home," she said, "more than I have ever been, more than I knew was possible." He looked at her, and she could see that he believed her because he could see it in her face, but he needed to hear it too, needed the words, and she understood that because she needed the words too, sometimes. "I love you," she said. "Every day I love you more specifically than the day before, which I would not have thought possible but which turns out to be the truth. The longer I know you, the more there is of you to love." He reached out and touched her face, just the back of his fingers against her cheek, and his eyes were very clear. "Etta Conley," he said, her maiden name, the name she had kept alongside his because she had told him when they married that she was a Conley as well as a Rourke, and that both things were true. "The day you told me to say please and mean it was the best day of my life up to that point. And after that point," she said. "Every day since," he said, has been better." She leaned forward and kissed him, and the fire burned low and the winter was outside and the children were upstairs and the land lay quiet around them. Their land, all of it theirs. The orchard and the creek and the graves under the live oaks and the cattle on the winter-gray pasture and the fences that needed no mending, for now, and the sky above the hills which was full of stars so numerous and so close that on a clear night like this one you could almost hear them. There was a morning in the spring of 1885, May again, which had always been the month Etta measured things by, when she stood at the kitchen window in the early light and watched her husband and her son walk out toward the orchard together. Callum was 6 now and tall for his age, and he walked with a stride that was already Rourke's stride, that deliberate, unhurried, ground-covering walk. Rourke had his hand on the boy's shoulder and was talking to him, and Callum was looking up at his father's face with the total absorption of a child who has found in his parent someone genuinely interesting to listen to. Me was still asleep. The kitchen smelled of coffee and bread. The apple trees were in bloom on the south slope, just as they had been on the morning Rourke first drove up in his wagon, and the same mockingbird, or the descendant of the same mockingbird, was doing its impersonations in the cedar breaks. Etta poured herself a cup of coffee and stood at the window and held it in both hands, warm against her palms. She was 35 years old. She was healthy and strong, and the accounts were solid, and the land was green, and her husband was walking with her son through the apple blossoms, and none of this had been inevitable. None of this had been given. She had made choices, and he had made choices, and the choices had been good ones, not just in the sense of outcomes but in the sense of what they had made them into, people who had reached each other at the level where reaching matters. She thought about the morning she had found the foreclosure notice on her door, the sky that terrible beautiful gold. She had stood on this porch and held the paper with the name J. Rourke on it and felt the ground shift under her feet. She had not known then that the shifting was not collapse but transformation. She had not known that the ground that came after would be more solid than the ground before, built on the foundation of her own terms and his honesty and the slow daily work of two people choosing each other in the full sight of everything they were. She would not have asked for the loss to get to the finding, but she would not change the finding, not a word of it, not a day. She heard me stirring upstairs, and then the particular quality of silence that meant me had decided to get up on her own, which at 3 years old she managed with the fierce independence of someone who had already decided that asking for help was a last resort. Etta set down her cup and moved toward the stairs, and at the kitchen door she paused and looked once more out the window at the two figures among the apple trees, the man and the boy in the morning light. "Jedediah," she said, just his name, quietly to the window and the light and the orchard beyond, just to say it, just to hear it in the warm kitchen air. Then she went to help me with her boots, and outside the blossoms moved in the spring wind, and the mockingbird sang somebody else's song in its own voice, and the hill country morning opened up around the Rourke farm as it always did, unhurried and full of everything that mattered. They would have 2 more years of quiet building before Callum started school in Harlan, and Etta began taking him in on Monday mornings. And those rides became their own kind of conversation, mother and son on the wagon seat with the hills going by. And she gave him what had been given to her, the knowledge of the land and the sky and the names of things, and the way the world works if you pay it proper attention. And Rourke was there when they came back, every Friday afternoon, standing in the yard in the particular way he had of standing when he was waiting for something he was glad to be waiting for. And me grew into herself with the magnificent certainty she had always shown, and by the time she was 4, she was the decided authority on several matters pertaining to the farm, including the naming of 3 new calves and the correct placement of the kitchen garden's bean poles, and nobody thought to argue with her, at least not with any expectation of prevailing. And the ranch flourished, and the orchard gave its fruit each autumn, and the creek ran clear and cold from the limestone hills, and the graves under the live oaks were tended with the love that is the truest form of memory, visited not in grief but in gratitude. A thank you said to the ground for holding those who had made all of this possible. And one evening many seasons later, when Callum was old enough to have his own opinions about cattle management, and me was old enough to make all of her opinions known at considerable volume and with considerable precision, Etta and Rourke sat again on the porch in the autumn dark, and the hills were the same hills and the stars were the same stars and the mockingbird's descendants still sang in the cedar brakes. He said, "Do you remember the first morning?" "Which part of it?" she said. "The part where I told you I had a proposition and asked you not to tell me to go to the devil." She smiled in the dark. "I remember. Were you going to tell me to go to the devil?" She considered honestly the way she did everything. "I was very close," she said, "but you were," she paused. "You were earnest, in a way that was hard to dismiss." "Earnest," he said, testing the word. "You meant the please," she said. "I could see that you meant it. And I thought a man who can mean a please that sincerely in that particular moment is worth hearing out." He was quiet for a moment. She could see his profile in the starlight, the familiar lines of it, the person she knew better than anyone and who knew her better than anyone. "Thank you," he said, "for hearing me out." She leaned her head against his shoulder and he put his arm around her, and the night held them both in the particular tenderness of a life that has arrived, fully and without reservation, at exactly where it was always trying to go. The land was theirs. The children slept inside. The apple trees were done for the year and resting. The cattle stood in the dark in the way of cattle, solidly and without much philosophy. The creek ran north toward south the way it always had, finding its way through the limestone the way water always does, following the deepest channel, wearing the stone smooth over years until the path is clear and certain, and the water runs free. They sat on the porch until the coyotes called in the distance and the stars turned overhead and the night grew deep and still, and neither of them felt any need to move, because everything they needed was right where they were, and had been for a long time, and would be for a long time still. This was the ranch. This was the life. This was the love that had begun with a foreclosure notice and a cup of coffee and a woman who looked a man in the eyes and said, "Only if you say please and mean it." He had meant it. And all the rest had followed from that, as all the best things do, from a single moment of complete and unguarded sincerity, offered and received and grown into something that neither of them could have imagined on that first golden morning, but that both of them, sitting now in the late night with the stars wheeling above the Texas hills, would not have traded for any other life that the wide world might have offered.